Hey guys, I was about 5 minutes into a video and I got a spam call and it messed the whole thing up. So let's start over again. I want to talk to you today about giving, about tithing, about generosity, about offerings, okay? And I'm probably going to break this into about 3 parts, and I'm not going to use a lot of scriptures. I'll reference some, I'll paraphrase some, but I ain't got my Bible, and that's for people like Jim Newsom and Mike McCarty to pull out all the verses. I'm just going to tell you. But I think it's important, and I think it's important for especially you that are starting to walk with the Lord or have been walking with the Lord for a few years and have never heard this, or my kids. It's not self-serving at all. I'm not asking you to give me any money. I'm just trying to teach you a principle that has blessed my life, and actually probably if you're on this page, because of that, it's blessed your life in some way. And so there's probably three segments here. There's several stories, but I want to talk about tithing, but I'm going to start at the beginning because that's the way I like to teach, is basically from A to B to C to whatever. I don't like to circle the wagons. So about 1991, I came into the kingdom in 89 or so, and being filled with the Holy Spirit, and that's a story on here. And I wanted to become a man of God, and it didn't take me long to realize I had no clue what that was. And I was surrounded by some men who were men of God. And one of them is on this page, and they became mentors for me. And I watched their lives, and I still admire their lives. I don't think I've ever lived up, the 4 or 5 guys, I don't think I've ever lived up anywhere close to their lives. But they affected me as father figures, as mentors, and stuff like that. And so I watched how they treated their families, how they operated their businesses, how much integrity they had, the principles that they lived by, which were foreign to me, but I was trying to do that. And one of the things that I wasn't taught directly, but I had heard indirectly, was about tithing. And so I had just kind of heard that the tithe was 10%. And we'll talk about the tithe, what it is and where it came from and all that stuff. But and so I was working for a dairy supply company, and one of my mentors had hired me to work for him as a sales rep. And I think that really opened my heart to becoming a sales rep, which led me into also owning a sales company. And but when I first got hired, I was so excited because I was going to make, with my commission, if I did a good job, around $2,000 a month, which I thought was a phenomenal amount of money. Now, I know to you guys in Ukraine and stuff, it is, but in America right now, 2,000 ain't gonna get you very far. But my mind was blown. I mean, I'm gonna make $2,000. So I went out and bought a trailer, I bought a truck, and I bought a bass boat. Now, the bass boat was a piece of junk. The truck was a piece of junk. And I had a trailer payment that included light bills, water bills, and all that kind of stuff. And then I had to buy food because I moved out, and I had to, kind of pay my own way. I got a couple of credit cards, which is real easy. I've never been very good at disciplining myself with food. Like, if I'm hungry, I go get something to eat. I don't care if it costs $10, $12, or whatever. But you do that 30 days a month, a couple of times a day, you've added up a bunch of money. Well, if you're only making, 2,000, it's a problem. And what I didn't know is there was a guy whose name was FICA who took a big chunk of your check every time. I had never experienced that, really. I mean, I was going to make 2,000, but after FICA and Social Security got it, I was making like $1,600. Well, that's like $400 out of my check. And then I hear about a tithe. Well, so I'm taking home $1,600. So I was like, well, I'm going to tithe. So now I'm tithing 160. So now I've got $1,500 and some credit cards. So basically every month for a few years, I could just basically make the interest payment on the credit cards. But I started tithing $160. Okay, because that was my check, and that's what I started tithing. And I felt pretty good about that. I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to. And I was in the office. So Mike McCarty, who's on this page, he and I used to meet regularly, and I love Mike, and Mike loves me, but we can butt heads. Like from day one, we've always been able to butt heads. And back when he was 35, I mean, I'm 53 now, but when I started out, I was like 21 and he was 35, and I thought I knew everything, and so it didn't take long for me to think, oh man, I know everything, and then Mike challenged me on everything. So we had some headbutting sessions, and I invited him. I went to his office and I would ask questions. We would talk, and one day we were talking about something, and I just casually mentioned I tithe off the net. What that means is when I get my check, I tithe off what I get, not the gross. And he said, well, I don't understand that. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, that's not a tithe. And I said, sure it is. I said, I get $1,600. I give $160. That's a tithe. He said, yeah, but what's your gross pay? And I said, well, it's like $2,000. And he said, well, then you should tithe $200. And I was like, no, I don't get $2,000. I get $1,600. And so he said, in a gracious way, he said, well, why don't you get your boss, whose name was Jimmy, to hold out your house payment, your car payment, your boat payment, your electricity, your lights, and your food bill, and then you don't have to give anything to the kingdom. Well, that pissed me off. I was like mad, but I went home and thought about it, and I'm like, I guess he's right. I didn't agree with it like that day. I don't even know I think Mike knows now I agreed with the statement, but on that day he knew I didn't agree with it. But I went home, spent a couple of days, and I'm like, he's right. So I started writing a check for $200 instead of $1,600. I tithed off the gross. And from that point up until another point, I will tell you, I always gave 10% of my gross check to the kingdom. I gave it to the church. And this is like step one. This on giving. There's multiple steps here, but I always did that. And what I found as I progressed in my career is that I was giving, and very few people I knew was in relationship with were giving. But for example, when Shannon and I got married, I was the breadwinner. She taught ballet, and she made some money, and I did, but none of that was used for our household income. I used that, but I always gave the 10%. And I would look around, and there were people that I knew that had two spouses whose income each matched mine, but they couldn't pay their bills. And I always thought that was odd. I mean, why don't you have any money? I mean, and part of it maybe because they bought brand new cars and I bought used, but a lot of it, I think, was the principle of blessing that came from giving. Now, this was just the first step in giving. This wasn't what I've learned. This is the first video, but I continued that tithe, and twice this has happened. But I was ministering in a church in Jackson as a youth minister, and I was talking to the pastor about the principle of giving. And I said, "What?" And I knew the congregation were struggling, and the church was struggling with finances. I said, "Why don't you teach on giving?" He said, "I've never taught on." He'd been a pastor 30 plus years, same church, and I said, "I've never taught on giving." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, I never wanted to see self-serving. I didn't want to seem like I was trying to get something for myself." And I was kind of a, I'm rough around the edges now, but back then I had pretty sharp points. And I just basically said, well, you're just cursing the people, because if you're not teaching them the truth, then their life is under a curse, and that's your fault. Well, it rubbed him the wrong way. I mean, just like in Mike's office, he rubbed me the wrong way. But the next week, he taught on giving. And I was surprised he did it. And he surprised me like much more, because he did a good job teaching on giving, teaching on tithing, teaching on that. But he actually challenged the congregation to give 10% of their income. I don't remember if it was gross or net. And he actually offered a money back guarantee. He said, if you will give 10% of your income, and if you're not in 6 months or 1 year, if you don't believe like God's blessed your life financially, then the church will give it back to you. And I couldn't believe it. I thought it was one of the most amazing things I ever heard. And I thought it was the craziest thing I ever heard, because I'm like, are you out of your mind? Half these people are crackheads and all this kind of stuff. Well, what happened after that, for a number of weeks, people were giving testimonies of financial surprises that came in their lives after they started tithing. And there were people that had been walking with the Lord for 30 years that had never tithed. And they're bringing checks and copies of checks and saying this, I got, and all this. And in the time I was there, I only remember he told me one person asked for their money back. But the whole church started giving. And it made a huge difference in their lives and in the life of the church. And so some years later, involved in a different church, conversation with one of my mentors, actually my original church, and I asked him, I said, have you ever taught on giving? And I was on the leadership council, so I was seeing the finances. Have you ever taught on giving? And he said, I've never taught on giving. And he'd been a pastor for close to 30 years. And I said, why not? He said, I never wanted to seem self-serving. I didn't want to teach on that. And I said, let me teach on it. Because at that time, I had no ministry. I had no reason to ask for any money on myself. So I did teach on it. And again, people started giving. And I believe, that the principle of tithing blesses your life. So that's kind of two stories. And so what is the tithe? Well, in the Old Testament, and as Christians, we're under the new covenant, so we're not actually under the old covenant, but that's for Bible teachers to help explain, read my book or whatever. But in the old covenant, the Old Testament, God instituted the tithe. And the tithe was for the Jewish people, his people, and it represented 10% of their produce. All right. So if they had tomatoes, then 10% of those tomatoes went to the Lord. If they had sheep, 10% of the sheep went to the Lord. If they had money, 10% of the money went to the Lord. And that was the tithe. It represented 10%. On top of that, there was offerings and generosity. And we'll talk about those things because that's what's more important today. But the tithe represents 10%. So I had a buddy who passed away a few years ago, and he really never knew the Lord. But I knew the Lord, and he knew my beliefs, and he knew my adoptions, and he knew the orphan ministry, and we fished together a lot. And I always figured that if he wanted to know something, he would ask me. I never tried to pressure him on the gospel until the last probably 6, 8, 10 months of his life. And he asked me one day, and this is the only question I think he's ever asked me, Christian-wise. We were driving down the road. He said, I want to ask you a question. I said, okay. He said, what is a tithe? And so I tried to explain it to him, but that was the only question that he'd ever had, Now, great story, the last 12 months of his life, I did share some things with him. Some other people shared, and he became a Christian, and he started going to church. He became a believer, and then he died. So great story of how God redeemed him, and there's a great story of how he was with me when God did an amazing miracle. But I've noticed this. So tithing has nothing to do with prosperity on the sense that you need to be prosperous to tithe. It's a principle for everybody. And so when I minister in poor countries or with poor people or with people that just get over their heads, I just have noticed that most people don't tithe. Okay. All right. And that does not prosper you. Now, what I have noticed in my own life, and I'm going to continue this, there's 2 or 3 segments to go with this, but what I've noticed in my own life is that when I give to God appropriately, I really don't miss it. And I'll have stories on that. And when I don't, I actually put myself under a curse. And I've had a season where I didn't, and then I did, and I'll talk about all that. So I don't want you to think too much about everything on segment 1, but I do want you to think about the idea that we are called as believers to trust God to be our provider. And part of that provision is that there's a portion that goes to Him. Now, we'll talk about what that portion might be, but it doesn't matter if we make $300 a month or $3,000 or $30,000. There's a portion that God expects, and when you do that, you do it in faith, and there is a blessing that comes with that. So anyway, hopefully this will be the first point of 3 maybe to encourage you. And I'll check back soon.